All I want now is to go back to my unsettled,
troubled,
modest,
confusing,
peaceful previous life.
But now, on the 13th day of the war, I realized that disaster, famine, mass deaths, and catastrophe were an integral part of my previous peaceful life.
So why do I call it peaceful? From habit.
It was never either peaceful or calm.
I was lucky to be born in 1978, during the most peaceful, tranquil period in my country's existence. For my first 12 years, I lived in relative prosperity, peace, and tranquility. So it seemed to me then.
I lived quietly,
Went to kindergarten, then to school.
ate bagels, drank kefir,
received chocolates at holidays,
Signed greeting cards to relatives,
Studied primers and political pamphlets.
and read Charles Dickens and Jules Verne.
I was often afraid that the Americans would drop an atomic bomb on us. Sometimes I would wake in a cold sweat after hearing the sound of a plane at night. But that passed.
It was only later, when I read my mother's diary after her death, that I realized that the peace and tranquility existed only in my childhood mind. For my mother, it was a life full of stress, sorrow, and daily survival.
but there was one in our family who, like me, enjoyed peace and tranquility. That was my grandmother, who had lived all her life in the village. She survived the Holodomor, the Nazis, Soviet collective farm slavery. But from 1978 to 1990, she finally could grow her potatoes in peace.
So, I grew up with a sense of peace and tranquility. I saw it as an inalienable right. I was a child of the 80s, of the 20th century.
Now I understand how naive this feeling was. A mistake for being born in a short period of peace and tranquility.
In the area where I was born, no one ever gave anyone the right to peace and quiet. And we, the Ukrainian children of the 1980s, had no privileges or rights. None. Who gave it to us? No one.
My mother was born in the remote village of Polisia in the north of Ukraine, where Russian tanks are now breaking into Kyiv from Belarus. Her ancestors lived there since ancient times.
From time immemorial, a curse hung over our family. No one had a normal home in which to live and earn a living. My great-grandmother, Katerina, spent her life saving money against the despotic will of her abusive husband. She eventually built her own home, but that drunken, abusive husband set it on fire and burned it down. So she packed up all her belongings and her children and went to live with relatives.
My grandmother was born in a small cabin, along with several dozen other people. When she was 16, the Holodomor began. She and her siblings survived because their mother, Katerina, had a secret can of moonshine. She gave each of them a spoonful of moonshine every day so that their bellies didn't swell from eating wild grass and bark like the neighbors' children. So they survived.
When she turned 18, my grandma ran away from home and settled near a stone quarry to give herself some freedom. There, she fell in love with a train driver who transported the quarry stones to the east. Moscow was built from this stone. Baba felt a certain peace and tranquility and even love. But then the war with the Nazis came, and her train driver got drafted into the army.
So Baba went back to the cramped cottage. And she married an old soldier who had caught yellow fever in the 1930s while serving in Abkhazia. He was kind and frail, and because of his disability, he was not called to the war. But when the Nazis came, they herded the women and all the others left in the village into an old wooden church. Then they set the church on fire. Miraculously, Baba escaped through a crack in the wall, but the rest of the villagers were burned alive.
After the war, she worked at a flax factory, but it was not enough to keep the house going. So every evening, she came home after dark with a bag of defective flax she'd salvaged from the factory. Until midnight, she'd spin the flax on an old wooden spinning wheel and fall asleep sitting upright. And at 5 in the morning, the foreman would knock on the window, and off to the factory she'd go again.
After 1978, Grandma was able to get a little more sleep. The foreman no longer went from house to house. Once a week, she could eat a can of condensed milk or a bar of chocolate. It was a time of peace and quiet.
My mother. When she was 16 years old, she left the village to get a job in construction in Kazakhstan. She believed in communism and wanted to make herself useful to the Soviet people. It was in Kazakhstan she first heard about the Soviet camps. She heard the horrific story of the Kingir uprising, where the prisoners revolted and they were brutally murdered. People told each other this story in whispers, looking around for fear they might be heard. My mother stopped believing in communism. She continued to believe only in classical music, poetry, and the human soul.
Fate took her to Lviv, where she worked as a metrological engineer, raising and feeding 3 children entirely herself because she had divorced her husband. He, by the way, continued to live in the same apartment because there was no money to rent another. Almost every day I was awoken by their arguments, since they were forced to share the same kitchen. Still, we lived in 2 rooms, not a single communal one like some of my friends, so in general I felt peaceful and calm and read Dickens on the warm tiles. It's just my nature. I'm an optimist. And my sister is not very much. Later, she went crazy because she felt she had the right to a normal life. But she did not. And it was not. In the end, she could bear it no more and went to live in a fictional world.
In the 1990s, there was very little money for food and clothing. Since then, I have gotten in the habit of buying most of my clothes in secondhand shops. Shops like these, which appeared at this time, allowed me to buy the clothes I like, instead of my brother's old Soviet jacket. I saved bottles to get money to buy clothes in these secondhand shops.
At least the vodka was cheap then. We students drank vodka on an empty stomach, smoking cheap cigarettes. Even to this day, I still have a stomach ulcer. It was normal in the Faculty of Philosophy where I studied to drink vodka on an empty stomach.
But in our new state of Ukraine, for some reason we now thought we had the right and privilege to peace and tranquility and dignity. So we went to political rallies and protests. First, Ukraine without Kuchma, then the first Maidan. All we needed was peace, tranquility, and dignity. We just wanted that right.
Then the second Maidan. Hundreds of peaceful protesters shot dead in the streets of Kyiv. But it only lasted a week. Peace and tranquility after the victory of the second Maidan lasted literally just a week. For that week, I lived with the belief that we were finally worthy of the right to peace and tranquility. Then the Russians landed in Crimea.
For 8 years, we listened daily to news of dead Ukrainian soldiers. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but I believed that this was all a terrible mistake. That we really do have the right to peace and tranquility and dignity. That in the end, this will all end at last.
But after 8 years, it did end. The Great War came. Burned, bombed, destroyed houses, the horrific deaths of thousands of citizens. So far, thousands.
On the one hand, it's a curse. I know sooner or later my house will be burned down, like my great-grandmother Katharina's house burned in the 1910s. It hasn't burned down yet, but these days, I've said goodbye to it a dozen times, like I've said goodbye to everything I hold dear, everything I can't bring with me when the Russian tanks come to Lviv. It's like seeing it burned a dozen times.
On the other hand, who actually gives anyone any rights? Where does the privilege of having peace and tranquility come from? I do not know. If Ukraine survives, I may have an answer to this question. Right now, I do not know.
I stand now in some darkness next to my sister and brother,
Next to friends,
Next to my deceased mother, grandmother, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-grandmother.
Next to all Ukrainians who died in this and other wars, and during periods of peace and tranquility.
They don't know, and I don't know. We just stare at the black darkness in front of us. The light from the house where we were born consumed by flames which do not illuminate the darkness in any way. How do we finally dispel this darkness? Can we?
What to write next, I just don't know.
Here is my list of books about war. I give it to you.
The Iliad.
The Song of the Nibelung.
The House at the Edge of the Night.
The Good Soldier Schweik.
The Tale of Igor's Campaign.
War and Peace.
quiet flows the dawn.
All quiet on the Western Front.
The Song of Roland.
The Little Prince.
And the stars are quiet here.
The Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
The unwomanly face of war, an oral history of women in World War II.
Vasily Dorkin.
The Fate of a Man.
Gone with the Wind.
The White Guard.
The Lord of the Rings.
For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Slaughterhouse 5.
Henry VI.
The Quiet American.
Dr. Zhivago.
The Empire of the Sun.
Gravity's Rainbow.
The Three Musketeers.
The Rout.
Rob Roy.
People with Weapons.
Testament of Death.
Parade's End.
The Legend of Till Eulenspiegel.
Cold Mountain.
I Romance.
From Here to Eternity.
The Kite Runner.
Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk.
Austerlitz.
Catch 22.
I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings.
Johnny Got His Gun.
The Naked and the Dead.
Tomorrow Was the War.
Restless.
Mr. Midshipman Hornblower.
Relocation.
The Killer Angel Matterhorn.
A Farewell to Arms.
The Thin Red Line.
This list will soon be significantly expanded.
I'm already somehow on my own.
When I was just a little girl, I asked my mother, what will I be? Will I be pretty? Will I be rich? Here's what she said to me. Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be.
Now I have children of my own. They ask their mother, what will I be?
Will I be handsome? Will I be rich? I tell them tenderly. Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera.
What will be, will be.
Que sera, sera.
Оця хороша пісня заспокоює.